What if the greatest scientist who ever lived looked into the void of the universe and found not emptiness, but something that terrified him more than death itself? Richard Feynman was not a soft man. He was not a poet. He was a man who dismantled reality with equations the way a surgeon cuts through flesh, without sentiment, without hesitation. He won the Nobel Prize. He cracked the Manhattan Project. He exposed the Challenger disaster with a glass of ice water and a rubber ring. This was not a man who trembled easily. Yet in the final years of his life, when the kidneys that sustained him were failing and the doctors had given him his sentence, Feynman began saying things that nobody expected. Not prayers, not confessions, something stranger, something more disturbing. He began talking about the nature of knowing. He said the most frightening thing a human mind can encounter is not death. It is the boundary where knowledge ends and something else begins. He did not call it God. He refused to call it God. But what he described was a presence, a structure so vast, so unreasonably precise, that the word accident could not fit inside it, no matter how hard you tried. He said that when you follow physics far enough, you stop arriving at answers and you start arriving at awe. And awe, he warned, is not the same as comfort. Awe is what you feel when something is so much larger than you that your mind cannot process it without shaking. Feynman, the man who laughed at religion, who mocked certainty in priests and politicians equally, that man, in his final days, sat at the edge of the universe and admitted he could hear something. He just refused to name it. What if science and God were never opposites, and the greatest minds simply lacked the courage to say it out loud? For 200 years, the battle lines seemed clear. Science stood on one side with its telescopes and particle accelerators. Religion stood on the other with its candles and its ancient texts. And the intellectual class, the ones with degrees and laboratories and reputations, made sure everyone understood which side they were on. Doubt was fashionable. Faith was weakness. Feynman played that game brilliantly. He was witty about it. He was sharp. He had a famous line that went something like, "The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." He aimed that razor at religious believers for decades. But here is what nobody tells you. In his final interviews, collected and transcribed by people who loved him, Feynman began to say something that cracked the comfortable atheism of his public image. He said that the universe operates according to laws, not tendencies, not suggestions, laws. Mathematical laws so precise that if the gravitational constant shifted by 1 part in 10 to the power of 60, no stars would form, no planets, no carbon, no life. He said that physicists had a word for this, fine-tuning. And he said that fine-tuning, if you follow it honestly, takes you somewhere deeply uncomfortable. It does not take you to a church. It does not give you a white-bearded man on a golden throne, but it takes you to a question you cannot escape. Why is the universe so unreasonably structured for complexity? Why does mathematics, invented in human minds, describe a cosmos that existed billions of years before human minds? That question does not have an equation. And Feynman, to his eternal credit, refused to pretend otherwise. What if the most honest thing a dying man ever said about God was the thing nobody dared to put in the headline? Feynman was diagnosed with 2 rare forms of kidney cancer. He knew exactly what the prognosis meant. He was a man of data, and the data was not kind. He had perhaps 1 year, maybe 2. And in that space, that extraordinary, compressed, luminous space between knowing and ending, he gave interviews that physicists still quote in hushed voices. He said that he had spent his entire life being comfortable with not knowing. That was his famous intellectual position, the beauty of not knowing, the freedom of uncertainty. But then he said something that shifted the entire weight of that philosophy. He said there is a difference between not knowing because the answer hasn't arrived yet, and not knowing because the answer exists in a category that human cognition cannot access. He said he suspected, deeply suspected, that the second kind of not knowing was real. That there were questions the universe was asking of itself that no instrument, no equation, no collider could answer. And that those questions, questions about consciousness, about why anything exists rather than nothing, about the unreasonable elegance of physical law, those questions felt to him like they belonged to a different domain entirely. Not religion, not mysticism, something he couldn't name. He said naming it would be dishonest. But refusing to acknowledge it, that, he said, would be the real intellectual cowardice. A man who fought his entire career against intellectual cowardice, looking at death and saying, "There is something here I cannot explain." That is not weakness. That is the bravest sentence a scientist can speak. What if consciousness itself is the crack in the universe through which something far larger is trying to speak? This is where Feynman's thinking becomes truly dangerous. Dangerous not to religion, but to the comfortable materialism that most educated people have quietly adopted as their default worldview. The hard problem of consciousness is this. We can explain how the brain processes information. We can map neural pathways, simulate chemical reactions, model synaptic firing. But we cannot explain why any of it feels like something. Why is there an experience of seeing red rather than just the processing of wavelengths? Why does grief feel like weight? Why does music feel like memory reaching backward through time? Feynman, who spent decades inside quantum mechanics, understood something that most people never confront, that at the subatomic level, the act of observation changes what is being observed. The universe, at its deepest layer, is not indifferent to being watched. It behaves differently when something is looking at it. He found this not comforting, but destabilizing. Because if the universe changes based on observation, then consciousness is not a passenger. It is somehow embedded in the architecture of reality itself. And if that is true, if mind is not an accident but a structural feature of existence, then the question of what generated that structure becomes urgent in a way that no amount of peer-reviewed papers can dismiss. Feynman did not become religious in his final years, let that be absolutely clear. But he did become something rarer and more honest than religious. He became genuinely uncertain. And a man of his intelligence being genuinely uncertain about the deepest questions of existence is more profound than 1,000 confident sermons from either side. What if the universe's elegance is not a coincidence, and the people who insist it is are the ones who haven't done the math? There is a concept in physics called the anthropic fine-tuning problem. It goes like this. The universe has approximately 26 fundamental constants. Numbers like the speed of light, the mass of a proton, the strength of the electromagnetic force. These numbers are not derived from deeper theory, they are simply measured. They simply are what they are. And when physicists began calculating what would happen if any one of these constants were even slightly different, not dramatically different, not obviously different, but shifted by fractions of a percent, the results were always the same. No stars, no chemistry, no planets, no life. The window inside which a life-permitting universe can exist is so impossibly narrow that the word coincidence requires a kind of faith that would embarrass most believers. Feynman was aware of this. He discussed it, and what made him unusual was that he refused the easy exits. He refused to say, "We'll explain it eventually," because he understood that explaining why the constants have the values they have requires going outside the system that contains those constants. You cannot use physics to explain why physics works. You cannot use the universe to explain the universe. Something stands outside. Whether you call that something God or the multiverse or the ground of all being, or simply the uncomfortable silence where the equations run out, it is there. Feynman felt it. And in those final months when his body was failing and his mind was still burning at full capacity, he sat inside that silence more honestly than perhaps any scientist of his generation. He did not fill it with noise. He let it be what it was. What if the last thing Feynman truly understood was the one thing he could never teach? He died on February 15th, 1988. His last recorded words, according to those who were with him, were about the wonder of not knowing. But this time, without the playfulness, without the bongo drums and the jokes about safecracking. This time, it was stripped bare. He said he had lived his whole life chasing the structure of things, atoms, particles, diagrams, fields, and he had gone far enough into the structure that he had seen something looking back. Not a face, not a voice, just a quality, an irreducible quality of the cosmos that felt to him like intentionality, like something had meant for things to be this way. He didn't elaborate. He couldn't. There are no equations for intentionality. There is no peer review process for the feeling that the universe is not simply running, but running towards something. And yet here is what makes that moment so devastating in its honesty. Richard Feynman had spent his entire career teaching people not to fool themselves, not to see patterns that weren't there, not to mistake comfort for truth. This was the man who said he would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And in the end, that man looked at the universe he had spent 69 years studying, and he did not close the case. He left it open. He left it open with the full weight of his intellect behind that decision. A man like that leaving a question open is not uncertainty. It is the highest form of honesty physics has ever produced. What if the man who understood atoms better than almost any human being in history, the man who drew diagrams of reality itself on cocktail napkins, who played bongo drums between Nobel lectures, who could explain quantum electrodynamics to a child and make it sound like music? What if that man, in the final weeks of his life, whispered something about God that the scientific establishment has never quite known how to hold? Richard Feynman did not believe in God. Not the God of Sunday school, not the God of burning bushes and parting seas. He was too honest for that kind of God, too rigorous, too relentless in his demand that every claim survive the punishment of evidence. He said once that the easiest person to fool is yourself, and he spent his entire life refusing to be fooled. By priests, by politicians, by comfortable illusions, by his own wishes. But there is a difference between not believing in a small God and being unafraid of something larger. And that is where Feynman's story becomes something that should shake every person in this room, not because it confirms religion and not because it destroys science, but because it does something far more unsettling. It reveals that at the very edge of human knowledge, where the equations run out and the instruments go silent, there is a quality to the universe that even the most rigorous mind cannot dismiss without flinching. He followed the physics, that's all he did. He followed it farther than almost anyone had followed it before. He followed it into quantum mechanics, where particles behave like ghosts, existing in multiple places at once until something looks at them. Where the act of observation changes what is observed. Where the universe, at its most fundamental level, is not indifferent to being watched. Think about what that means. Sit with it for a moment. The universe changes when something is watching it. That is not metaphor. That is not poetry. That is the result of laboratory experiments repeated millions of times with extraordinary precision. And Feynman knew those experiments more intimately than almost any person alive. He didn't find them comforting, he found them destabilizing. Because if observation is woven into the architecture of reality, if the universe responds differently when a conscious mind is present, then consciousness is not an accident sitting on the surface of physics. It is embedded in physics. It belongs there. And then there are the numbers. 26 fundamental constants govern the behavior of the entire universe. The speed of light, the mass of an electron, the strength of gravity, the cosmological constant. These are not derived from deeper equations. They are simply measured. They simply are. And when physicists calculated what would happen if any one of them were changed, even slightly, even by fractions so small they are almost impossible to articulate, the answer was always the same. No stars would form, no chemistry would occur, no planets, no oceans, no carbon, no life, no you, no me, no anyone to ask the question. The window in which a life-permitting universe can exist is so unimaginably narrow that the probability of it being accidental requires a faith in coincidence that would embarrass most theologians. Feynman knew these numbers. He had calculated inside them his entire career, and he refused the easy exits. He refused to say, "We'll explain it eventually," because he understood, with the precision of a man who had gone as deep into the structure of things as a human being can go, that you cannot use physics to explain why physics works. You cannot use the universe to explain why the universe is the way it is. You cannot reach outside the system from inside the system. Something stands outside. He didn't call it God. He was too careful for that. But he called it something. He called it the unreasonable elegance of physical law. He called it the fine-tuning that no instrument could explain. He called it the silence at the end of the equations, the place where mathematics runs out and something else begins, something he could feel the shape of but could not name without being dishonest. And then there is the consciousness problem. Why does anything feel like something? We can trace every neuron, we can model every synapse, we can describe in extraordinary mechanical detail how the brain processes the wavelength of red light. But we cannot explain, not even slightly, not even in principle, why that processing feels like seeing red, why grief has weight, why music reaches into a part of you that has no biological name, why you are experiencing this moment rather than simply executing it. Feynman had lived inside quantum mechanics long enough to know that mind was not separate from the physical world, and that terrified him in a way that black holes did not. Because a universe that is fine-tuned for life, that changes in the presence of consciousness, that produces minds capable of asking why it exists, that universe is not random. It is not indifferent. It has qualities that the word accident cannot accommodate without bending language until it breaks. He was 69 years old. His body was failing. 2 rare cancers. The doctors had been honest. The data was not kind. And in those final months, in that luminous, compressed, terrifying space between knowing and ending, Feynman gave interviews that physicists still quote in whispered voices in corridors at conferences, as if speaking them too loudly might disturb something. He said that the universe had structure that felt like intention. Not the intention of a person, not the intention of a being with wishes and moods and a preference for one tribe over another. Something older, something more fundamental, something that had arranged the laws of physics so that complexity was not just possible, but, in the long run, inevitable. He said that there were questions the universe was asking of itself that no collider, no telescope, no equation could answer. That those questions felt like they belonged to a different domain entirely. Not religion, not mysticism, but something for which humans had not yet built the vocabulary. He said refusing to acknowledge those questions would be intellectual cowardice. And Richard Feynman was afraid of many things, but intellectual cowardice was not one of them. He died on February 15th, 1988. Among his last recorded reflections was this, that he had spent his life chasing the structure of things, and that he had gone far enough into the structure to see something looking back, not a face, not a voice, a quality, an irreducible quality of the cosmos that felt to him like it had meant to be this way. He left it at that. Richard Feynman's story is not the story of a man who found God on his deathbed. It is something harder and more important than that. It is the story of a mind so honest, so relentlessly disciplined, that it followed the evidence all the way to the edge. And at the edge, instead of retreating into comfortable certainty in either direction, it stood in the open air and said, "I do not know what this is, but it is something." The universe is too precisely structured, too unreasonably elegant, too deeply entangled with the consciousness that observes it, to be nothing. To call it nothing requires more faith than calling it something. And if the greatest physicist of the 20th century could hold that question open with humility and courage, then perhaps the rest of us can afford to stop fighting about the answer long enough to actually feel the weight of the question. Because that weight is where the truth lives. Not in certainty, not in doctrine. In the trembling, electric, unbearable wonder of not knowing, and being honest enough to say so.